All right, guys, it's time for the Next Level Guy Show, a men's interview, interest, and improvement-focused podcast featuring interviews with the greats from all industries to help you better your life. Each week, a new episode features an interview with one of the greats, covering all aspects of their story, from life hacks to tips and protocols that have allowed them to live life on the next level. We then highlight concrete action steps that you can use to improve your life. And now, your host, Ian Dawson McKay.
And today's guest is Dr. Mike Piekarski. Dr. Mike, aka Dr. Kickass, is a doctor of physical therapy, a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt, and a former MMA, which is mixed martial arts fighter, on a mission to keep combat athletes in peak condition. With first-hand experience in the demands of grappling, striking and fighting, Dr. Mike bridges the gap between rehab and performance, helping fighters recover smarter, train harder, and prevent injuries before they happen. Whether you're rolling on the mats or stepping into the cage, his expertise ensures you stay in the fight for the long run. Tune in to learn how to train, recover, and compete like a true warrior. And now, let's get to the interview. Well, thank you so much for coming on. It's an absolute honour. I've followed you on social media now for a while. But could you explain who you are and what you do?
Sure. My name is Dr. Mike Piekarski. I'm a doctor of physical therapy, but I'm also a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt. I used to fight mixed martial arts. So social media, I created the handle Dr. Kickass, which essentially is like an educational platform where I kind of educate martial artists on various injuries, rehab, or something that might be related to martial arts.
So you had a wee bit of cross-training when you were younger and a few injuries and stuff like that. But what was your sort of introduction to martial arts? I know you're probably fed up of saying it, but what was that initial kind of jolt into the sport for you?
So as a kid, I was a giant Ninja Turtle fan. Jean-Claude Van Damme, I was big into blood sport. So that's like what started me. And then I kind of dabbled with like traditional martial arts, but like when I say dabbled, like I would do like 2 months of like karate or kung fu. And, so I didn't really get into martial arts until I got to college. And, the last martial art that I did, before when I was in high school was I did like 2 or 3 months of Japanese jiu-jitsu. And then I needed a knee surgery. So that took me out for about 3 years. Fast forward, I go to college and they have a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu club. I'm like, well, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, that's probably close to Japanese Jiu-Jitsu. And then after my first class, I was hooked.
That's like me. I was humming and hawing about it, and then I went to one class, and before I knew it, I came out of it, and I was like, I don't know if I liked it. Get my blue belt about a year later. I was like, yeah, I think I did. But it's something else. It's another beast entirely, isn't it? Now, when you hurt your knee initially, was that your sort of first major injury? Was that your first kind of insight into kind of
Sure.
coming back and the rehabbing?
So interestingly, so my knee injury had nothing to do with martial arts. I'm someone that has what's called a shallow trochlear groove. So the way my kneecap sits on the femur, it doesn't have like a good fit, so it slid out of place, right? So it's called a patellar subluxation. And then once it happens anytime a joint goes out of place, you're more prone to it happening again. So over a year or so, it happened several times. I attempted physical therapy. In hindsight, I don't think it was the physical therapy's fault. I think I was just like a 14-year-old kid where I like wasn't really super committed to rehab. Like I would go in and I would go do stuff, but I really wasn't like pushing myself. So then because it kept happening, I ended up having a surgery. And the surgery they called a lateral release, which they don't really do very much anymore because the outcomes now are fairly poor. But the idea is that they're trying to like disconnect some of the connective tissue, the retinaculum patella. The idea is that if they kind of trim the lateral connection, there's going to be less of a pull, so it doesn't go out of place. The problem with that is, one, it doesn't really have a great outcome on reducing subluxations, but two, because of that, now my knee is a lot weaker because some of the quad muscle doesn't have the same attachment to the patella. So like even to this day, my injured quad is about like 50% the strength of my uninjured quad, and that was like over 20 years ago.
Because it's quite interesting nowadays, isn't it? It's like with the typical healing modalities, it's just, stop doing it. Go put it, slab some ice on it. You know, there's not really that much of a kind of an interest in it. Did you kind of lean towards it? Because I heard you summarize your path into it when you found your career, when you're balancing between your martial arts training and your schoolwork.
Sure.
Was that the kind of lead into it that you realized that there is better ways of rehabbing and stuff? Because you say to a 14-year-old, "Oh, this will affect you when you're older." They don't care. You know, how did you kind of go into the combat athlete field of things, and how did you find that career path?
So originally, I was fast forward. I'm competing in jiu-jitsu. I'm starting to have MMA fights. So I think when I was fighting, which was around 2011, and it might be, I don't know if it's different now, but the sport has grown. But generally that I would see that there was two types of people. There was people that were good enough athletes and they were skilled enough and they can get into the UFC. Generally, you're looking at, especially at the time, entry level UFC is like 10,000 to show, 10,000 to win with, I think they're getting their sponsors. So like best case scenario, if you win your 3 fights, which doesn't always happen, you can kind of make an okay living, right? But if you're not in the UFC fighting for that, like what I would see, there was these guys that would be like outside the UFC and they're kind of like fighting for peanuts. They're taking short notice fights or taking fights injured because they just need to get a better record. And I was like, I don't think I'm as good of an athlete as I need to be to make a career of this. Like, obviously, I was good enough to win, but not necessarily to like make a career out of it. So I was kind of thinking about, like, do I want to be a personal trainer? Because I was thinking maybe I would open a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu gym. But the problem is at the time I was living in upstate New York, and it really wasn't, in my opinion, a desirable place to kind of like set my roots where I would. Because like once you open a gym, you're not leaving, right? I mean, you can, but just put all that work in. So I was like, maybe if I was a personal trainer, I could do that on the side while I try to grow a gym. And then especially at the time, I didn't have the temperament to be a personal trainer, because to be a personal trainer, you're a salesman, right? And I was not that guy. So then I looked into physical therapy, and I was like, well, I don't really want to go back to school. And I was trying to apply to be a physical therapy assistant. And I don't know if this is a thing where you're from, but in the U.S., it's an associate's level degree. You need a license. I didn't know that. So I'm applying for jobs, and someone's like, hey, you need to be licensed for this. So I was like, okay. So I was observing to see if, maybe I would want to get my associates in this. So I'm observing. And then the people, I was observing a physical therapist, are like, look, if you already have a bachelor's degree, which I did, so like, you might as well just go and get the doctor. I was like, yeah, but I don't really want to go back to school for 3 years and accumulate all this debt. But the problem is if, let's say I was a physical therapy assistant, it's a 2-year associates and there's no bridge program. And as a physical therapy assistant, you kind of have to like do what you're told. And I realized I don't really like following rules, so I kind of want to do my own thing. So that was kind of what motivated me to go to physical therapy. I actually didn't plan on somehow combining physical therapy and martial arts. It was something I thought that the fields were close enough that I would be interested, and I would actually be interested in studying. And it wasn't until I started practicing that I realized that I could maybe make a living working like with this specific population.
Because that was my kind of understanding when I went to rehab. It was just like it was the same exercises over and over again. There was no individuality. There was no kind of focus on, well, what are you going to do? Or really even looked at my height compared to the next guy. It was all kind of the same lateral raises, the same this, the same that. What's your opinion then on the current way of doing it? Because athletes say, "Oh, it hurts when I do this," and they say, "Well, don't do that." But if that's your sport, like throwing a punch, you can't stop throwing a punch if your shoulder's sore. You've got to find a workaround. And I think you're the first person I found that actually looked at the body, the physiology, the kind of fixes from a combat sort of sport.
Sure.
Do you find that that's a problem nowadays? Is that a lot of medical things are more just about just keeping you moving and alive rather than actually, able to do the sport or the lifestyle you want?
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, the answer is if it hurts, don't do it. In my opinion, that's a very lazy, incomplete answer. Partly this is based on the medical field, which is like it's insurance based. Like insurance really doesn't care if you're getting back to jiu-jitsu, boxing, etc. They're just like, do you not have pain? So that's why the medical model is kind of focused more on, okay, well, let's kind of manage pain. Let's make you feel better. We'll give you some type of cortisone injection and get it calmed down. But again, in my opinion, that's a very lazy way to approach it, because if you tell any athlete, hey, like, don't do this, what they're going to do is they're going to ignore you. And I think that's why the jiu-jitsu community or the combat sports community, for the most part, is very distrustful of the medical system, because they go see you also have to consider too, a primary care physician, they're a jack of all trades, right? They're really good at a lot of things, but they're not really great at anything. Like their job, if you're a primary care, is to get you to somebody who knows more than them, right? So they know a little bit about musculoskeletal, but that's not their thing. So they're like, okay, well, I go into primary care. I knew I had an injury. I knew what it was. But I wanted to get an image to confirm, and it was like pulling teeth. Like they have to do their assessment, and they're doing it terribly wrong. At the end, they're like, "Oh, I think you have a knee sprain," and it was like, "No, that is not it at all." Like I had a bit of cartilage that was floating around in my knee, so I needed the image to confirm that it was there, because you need surgery to take it out. Like there is, And they're like, I think it's a knee sprain. I'm like, no, that's not it whatsoever. Like the way that they were doing the test was wrong. So I think if you're an athlete, you should be going to an orthopedic physician or a sports physical therapist who really understands the sport, who could help you. Because again, like for me, like I understand jiu-jitsu, understand combat sports. It hurts when I throw a punch. Well, let's kind of work on this, because I mean, obviously there could be a joint problem, which is true, but there also could be a skill problem. And even though I don't always want to tell someone you can't do this, a better response is, I want you to avoid this movement, but these are the movements you can do. So now there's going to be a little bit more buy-in.
So do you think then that a lot of people, it's almost on us as much as the practitioner, because we won't be lazy. We want to just take the general advice in men's health or the general warm-up or the program that we see that there are some, Billy Joe's selling, that even though it's something about our health that will keep us alive, we're lazy in our senses. So we don't know any better. So we just accept what somebody says. Is it that we're badly educated, the users as much as the providers?
I mean, I'm biased, right? Because like I do work with people. I work with people remotely too. So it's like there is the case, which is, okay, well, I'm just going to go get medical advice. This is what they said. I'm not really going to try to go out for more. There is obviously a financial thing, right? So people are like, well, I have a medical insurance. It covers me to see this person, and I think especially in the US, seeing people in a cash-based setting is becoming a lot more common. So I think that is kind of changing things, but it's for the person, right? There are some people, they just want the free advice. They don't really want to be as thorough. Like I noticed this with combat athletes, and it's been pretty bad lately, just seeing some stuff. I think a lot of combat athletes are pretty much like drug addicts. Like they're going to do whatever they can to go back to training, whether they should or not. Like they hurt their knee. They're like, okay, well, it's not good. I'm just going to put a knee brace on, and it makes me feel better. So all they're really doing is they're putting that knee brace on, which is giving them false security that they can go back to training, when in reality that's not the case. And they're just more putting themselves at risk of re-injure themselves or making it worse.
I can remember rolling with a guy, and I think I went for an arm bar, and his arm popped I think it was at the forearm, and it was an old injury, and it kept doing it. And he said, "Oh no, it's fine, it's fine." I said, "Just go sit out, we'll finish the round here." And he stuck it in his belt and carried on rolling. And I kept saying to him, just stop. It's obviously, we don't want to damage it. And he was out for about 2 months after. And it was just that ego was leading him. Do you think that's where guys go wrong? We come to you when something's truly fucked up rather than when it's on its way. Because I think you had something where you said you'd rather see it when it's an itis, not when it's an actual proper complex oxus. Are guys idiots and we wait to that point where it's hanging off to come to see you?
Absolutely. I mean, from like an acute setting, right? Like, let's say you have your elbow popped. Like, if I can address that early, it's so much easier to manage, right? But the problem is people don't. They're like, okay, well, I have an elbow injury for 5 years. And like, so at this point, it's going to be so much harder to deal with because, so the elbow is the most commonly injured joint in competition, primarily especially in jiu-jitsu, particularly from not tapping to an arm bar. So the most common limitation that I see among grapplers is they can't straighten their elbow anymore because they've had their elbow traumatized so many times because they're not tapping to arm bars, so they've lost that range of motion. And obviously what happens first, you're kind of stretching the joint capsule, you're traumatizing the ligament. But if you keep doing it over and over and over again, now what you're actually starting to do is you're actually creating physiological changes to the bone. And then people start to develop these bone spurs, these bony osteophytes that get lodged in the elbow. So if you wait that long, that is now a surgery thing. Like, there's no amount of rehab. There's literally these chunks of bone in the joint that you have to take out. So if we can manage things earlier, it's going to be way, way better. Second thing, the whole hand in the belt thing. So I've been doing jiu-jitsu for a long time, so I've done that before I was a physical therapist. Every single time I try to just train around an injury that I shouldn't have, I put my hand in the belt. Not only did I re-injure myself every single time, but I just delayed getting back. And I feel like some people, they just want to get back whether they should or not. So they're kind of like they're like training at like 30, 40% for a prolonged period. When at some point it'd be better to just take time off, rehab seriously, and then come back at 100%. Because they're just in this constant injury state and they just never get back to like where they can train the way they need to.
So what's the kind of breakdown that you see between, the general wear and tear? I mean, I was training with a broken finger. I strapped it up. I had turf toe. And then I had cellulitis in my leg, which was one of the worst things I've ever had. And I remember I had to stop training with that. I've seen people sprawl and carry on the next day with a dodgy neck and stuff.
Sure.
How much is seeing mistakes causing serious injuries to general wear and tear or a mix of the both? What's your sort of common thing? Because you said about the elbow being the kind of main culprit. Sure. Where are the kind of typical things? Is it like core, knee, ankle, that kind of areas?
The most common, like when I say macro and micro, so macro would be like somebody like pops your knee in a leg lock, or you get your knee pops in a leg lock, in like a takedown. Okay, that'd be a macro injury. Micro injury is that accumulation of trauma. Okay, so the knee is by far the most commonly injured joint across like all grappling sports, whether it's wrestling, judo, or jiu-jitsu. Probably also mixed martial arts, but the knee is the most common big injury, right? I would say the neck and the back tend to be more of those like micro injuries. It's the trauma. Sure, there's ways that people will crank their neck, but usually it's not that. It's just the accumulation of just not tapping, or like it's pretty common in jiu-jitsu, like people are inverting, but they don't really have the body for inverting. So they're just kind of like forcing themselves into these positions they don't really have. That's really how they're going to get hurt.
It's like me. I'm like the Michelin man. Anytime I try any of that rolling stuff, I'm just like, how do people do this? Like,
yeah.
And have you noticed a change recently then? Because nowadays it's all about leg locks, whereas before it was kind of, we're stand up more. And, do you see a more kind of a change in the injuries because of the focus of the sport? How it's moved and how it's sort of the flavour of the attacks in the sport change. Now it's all seated guard and leg locks. Is it different than it was, say, 10 years ago?
Interestingly, Most research that a lot of this stuff that I'm looking at is pretty consistent in literature. It hasn't really changed. The mechanism might be different. Like, so I was, it was like 2011. That was when, 2021. Sorry. Heel hooks became legal in the IBJJF. So like the first big event, which was no-gi pans, I went to collect injury data. And it's a paper that I'm hoping to release this year. Hopefully I can get it published. But because that was the first major tournament where heel hooks were legal in the IBJJF, what we could do is we were able to compare knee injuries from, I think it was 2009. So the knee injuries had increased, but not to a statistically significant amount. However, the knee injuries where heel hooks were legal, if you compare like an adult versus masters, went up like 12 times. It was a pretty crazy jump from how many times people got injured in the divisions where heel hooks were legal.
So how much of this is like a badge of honor? You know, is it like that you expect to see the black belt with the taped fingers that when they take them off, they look like, you know, like some scarecrow, that the guy can hobbles in and he just sits and he's got amazing pressure because he can't move.
Sure.
So he does pressure passing rather than all the other flow stuff. Why do guys see it as a badge of honor that, oh yeah, I used to bench such and such, but my shoulders now. I used to score 5 touchdowns like Al Bundy in Married with Kids, but my knee's blown now. Why do we see that as a kind of a badge rather than you've given up your life because you never got an injury fixed, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, this is also what I do, so I think it's idiotic. Like, most people, you know, like you said, like you see those old veteran black belts like hobble onto the mat, and all they can do is like knee shield, half guard, and pressure passing, because that's all their body will let them do anymore. And like, if you look at like an athlete, right, and we'll say athlete, whether it's competitive or recreationally, you know, you start this sport, for the most part, you don't have too many injuries. You start to accumulate all these little injuries that you kind of ignore. Then they start getting worse. You know, when an injury happens, you know, you don't go back to like 100%. Maybe you're at like 98%. But then you've accumulated all these things. So then you can look at these like veteran fighters. Despite having all this knowledge, their body is at like 70% of where it was like 5 years prior. And then there's going to be the point where it's like they're so diminished that they like, well, it's not worth me trying to compete because my body's too broken. And again, we can say this from a competition standpoint. There's also a lot of people that just want to train, but then you get to a point your body's so beat up. They're like, is it even worth training, right? Because, I mean, the nature, unfortunately, is that father time is undefeated, right? You train long enough, you're going to be 50 years old, you're going to start training with those 20-year-olds, and, you know, you're not going to be able to necessarily keep up. So I think that is when people stop, you know, training. And I think it's pretty common. You see those older black belts, they don't, like, especially instructors, they just stop rolling because, like, again, there's an ego, right? Like, they don't necessarily want to go with that younger purple belt who can tap them. So they just essentially start training less and less to the point they're not even rolling anymore. So I think it's very idiotic. Like, I would like to be like Helio Gracie. Granted, he wasn't like rolling with like pro MMA fighters, but he was doing some portion of jiu-jitsu up until his 80s or 90s. And I think that longevity is what people need to see and do.
Yeah, I've had a few coaches like that where they'll tell you it's because they want to observe from the side for promotions, but you know fine well it's because they just don't want to take a chance of getting tapped by the interesting spazzing, shall we say, of some athletes. I mean, I've worked with people where they've ripped an arm on a girl and severely hurt her, and then he's put his hand up looking for his next partner. And he had to be asked to leave. You know, I've trained with people who are almost too afraid to make a move because they don't want to hurt people. You know, there's a whole range of different kind of athletes and attitudes in jiu-jitsu. But is it that we're also affected by our bad postures, you know, like kind of the head bowing, always looking at our phones, our bad postures, the way we're sitting? What are like our standard movement patterns that we should be able to do? You know, because a lot of people could barely get their legs over their head. Like,
sure.
If they start, a lot of people can barely squat down. Or what are kind of basic movement patterns that everybody should reasonably be expected to do if you're fit and healthy?
So I guess that's an interesting question. So the way that I define joint health, and it's not things that people are going to be able to reproduce from this video, but essentially is I want a joint to be able to move in every degree of freedom it can without pain and compensation. And the range of motion quantity is going to be based on what you need to be doing. Meaning, so you take the shoulder moves in every degree of freedom, means it goes in the sagittal plane, in the frontal plane, and then the rotational plane. So I have to make sure it can do that. A lot of times when people were doing that, they're trying to rotate their shoulder and they're getting compensation somewhere else, which essentially means that they are unable to do that, right? So we already know it gives us an idea. Maybe they're not doing it because they've never done it and they've just that their shoulders lost that capacity. Maybe it hurts because they have an injury. There's some people, like that's pretty common with people who have a lot of, maybe they do a lot of yoga, they do a lot of stretching, but they don't have great control. They don't have great body control. So their joints can move really well, but they can't control themselves, right? So that's how I would look at it. From a movement, the way that I break it down would be there's several movement milestones that I use with my athletes as I'm returning them to sport for a combat art. So for me, one of the first ones is, can someone do a full deep kneel? Can you kneel, right? It's like sitting in closed guard. So if someone has an injury or they have an arthritic knee and they can't do that, that's going to be a problem. If someone tries to sweep you back, you're going to hurt your knee. Next is I want to make sure someone has a deep squat, right? Because you're going to be doing a lot of jiu-jitsu. You need to be in those deep positions whether you're passing. And if you think about it, a combat base is kind of the combination of a deep squat on one side and a kneel on the other, right? So those are some like basic movements that I want to do for like the lower extremity. For the upper extremity, I want to make sure that people can like do essentially like a single arm plank, right? So because I have to make sure that if, let's say, I'm passing or if I'm trying to maintain top position, someone bumps me, I can make sure that I can catch myself versus if I can't support myself with one arm and someone bumps me, you know, I'm going to hurt my wrist, my elbow, my shoulder. For the spine, you know, you don't have to be an inverter to be good at jiu-jitsu. Like inversion and Granby's, that's obviously based on your style. But I do want to make sure that people have the ability to create like a spine rock. So can you rock up and down? You know, your feet don't have to go all the way down to the ground, but I want to make sure that your back can create this rigid wheel. That's how I know that it's going to be safe for jiu-jitsu.
It's really hard not to start taking notes because I love how deep diving that you do in all the, like every one of your posts, every one of your videos. It's always kind of like there's so much to take from it. There's that scene in the Terminator, I think it's number 2, where Sarah Connor says to the Terminator, "You've got files on the human anatomy," and he says yes, and she says, "Oh, because it makes you a better killer." Yeah. Do you think it makes you better at jiu-jitsu, that you understand that if I come this way, if I pull the arm that way, you understand the body? So if we understood I can't speak today, the setup of the body a bit more, it'd make us more efficient in submissions and stuff like that?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, so I remember when I was in physical therapy school, one of the first classes you take is kinesiology. So kinesiology is the study of human movement. And one of the biggest takeaway is that every sweep and every takedown is going to be based on understanding balance, meaning that your center of mass, which is usually around your belly button, and then your legs are your base of support, right? Anytime you can move the center of mass outside of the base of support, they are now off balance, right? So every takedown, every throw means that you have to move their center of mass. They're off balance. Then what people are going to do is their response is either a step, like they step to alter their base of support, or if it's on the ground, they reach, right? Because that's the point, right? So now your next step is to block the step or reach. And if you think like that, that's every takedown and every sweep, right? Boiled it down. Make them off balance, block their step or reach response. And if you do that, you essentially succeed. From a joint lock perspective, I would say before physical therapy, before I went to physical therapy school, I was terrified of heel hooks. Essentially, I was at a point where I would just lock the heel, and I just said, okay, I'm not going to apply pressure because if I do, their leg's going to explode. And then I remember I I was in a tournament. I'm trying to footlock people, and they just didn't tap, right? Because I had really poor breaking mechanics. And then it wasn't until I was finishing physical therapy school, and I went to a Gary Tonin seminar, and that's when things clicked, because that's when the topic of breaking mechanics for a heel hook really like set in on me. And I'll be honest, you kind of have to try a little bit to try to break somebody's leg. Obviously, you shouldn't be doing that in training. Competition's a different beast. But once I had a better understanding of the way that the knee moves, it absolutely enhanced my ability for breaking mechanics for like a heel hook or even an arm bar. Because traditional, you're thinking like when you do an arm bar, right? You want thumb up, because if they're thumb up, that means their elbow's down. So when you apply pressure, right, you can hyperextend the elbow. But really, the key thing is you need to just make sure that they don't have their thumb down. So if I have their palm up, I can armbar someone just because I understand that actually could be a better position to break the arm. Because like when you have an armbar and your thumb is up, now you're supported by the bone locking in place. But when the palm is up, you don't have that support. It's all ligamentous. So that actually could be a potential way to injure the elbow more if you were in a situation you needed to.
Because when I initially did jiu-jitsu up to blue belt, and I didn't really understand it, and I kind of plateaued, and I'm going back in start of October. I've like signed up. I'm really excited, obviously shitting it, because I know I'm going to get barred for the first 19 years. But in my head, my brain is I'm watching a lot of videos, and I'm starting to notice a lot more of these analytical kind of, they stop the scene as the sweep comes in, and they'll show you the momentum, and they'll use like the graphics on screen to show you how the joint's going or how he's going to play into it. And I'm getting to understand it on a deeper level. And as I started reading your posts, I was thinking, I'm getting to understand how the knee moves and why that move works, because you're moving it against its natural plane. And your stuff is superb, but it's also really kind of all these nefarious uses I was thinking, you could use to it. But how would you want somebody who's new coming to this, or a fat guy like myself coming back to jiu-jitsu, how much is between skill development, sport-specific, physical preparation, mobility, flexibility, strength? How do we break it down? Because I'm assuming we should do some weight training as well. We should also do some cardio, because everybody says roll more. It doesn't work.
Sure.
How do we start reducing our weaknesses and building our strengths in that kind of scene?
Well, so the overall answer is it should be based on the individual, right? So if you come to me and you're like, okay, I want to get back to jiu-jitsu, so we could talk about skill development and physical capacity development, right? Mm-hmm. And then we can kind of define what people have, their maximal strength, their muscular endurance, their power. We can look at their joint health, their joint mobility. We can look at their aerobic cardio. We can look at their anaerobic cardio. So that would be physical capacity. And I think that for the most part, that's a little bit more relevant for a competitor. Like for you, if you're not competing, you're just training. Like if you get smoked or you smoke everyone in the gym, it doesn't really matter, right? Like I'd almost want you to have less of a focus on the physical capacity. Strength training absolutely is going to help reduce injury. I mean, that's just that it's pretty consistent in the literature. You should be doing joint training or strength training, I should say. Joint training, it would be a little bit more specific way to look at it, because when people are doing strength training, they're just doing like what you see. So it's going to be very common bilateral, meaning both arms or both legs, sagittal plane movements. So like a bench press, a squat, and a deadlift. And those are all obviously really important. But from an injury prevention standpoint, we want to be training the joints in the planes where they're going to be injured. So you take a shoulder. The shoulder typically gets injured from a rotation. So you should be including some type of rotational training for your shoulder, right? You look at the knee. Knee injuries are often either a degree of freedom, the knee doesn't go, which is the frontal plane, like someone collapsed on their knee, or they're rotational based. You should be probably incorporating some type of rotational knee training into your program if your goal is injury prevention, right? We look at mobility. How much flexibility do you really need? Well, that really based on you and what you need to be doing for your sport, i.e. jiu-jitsu. So What do we need in jiu-jitsu? We need to have good shoulder rotation. We need to have good spine flexion to be able to curl into a little ball. We need abnormal hip rotation specifically. So these are some of the things that we can do. And if you don't have them, I would say I would prioritize that. So usually what I do is my baseline is making sure people have good joint health, good mobility. Tap that. I would have some type of base strength program. Conditioning is really based on the person, right? Because again, if you're just a recreational athlete, like how important is cardio, right? I think having a strong aerobic base is going to be very important. One, for just like overall longevity, not just in jiu-jitsu, but the better aerobic capacity you have, the better that you're going to be able to recover between rounds, the better you're going to be able to recover between jiu-jitsu sessions. So obviously that's super important. And maximal strength, again, and power, those are obviously important, but I think they're a little bit more needed for a competitor. Okay. If we talk about skill training, I mean, really for recreational hobbyists, like that should be your focus. It's just like get better at jiu-jitsu. I always tell people, I don't care if you get tapped by someone lower. All I care is that you're getting better at jiu-jitsu. So I wish if when I was a blue and purple belt, I didn't try to just win gym rounds, because at the end of the day, who gives a shit if you're the king of the mat? No, nobody cares, right? It's better to be better at jiu-jitsu. So if you kind of like lose that day, but now you're better at jiu-jitsu, you're going to continually like reach your goal. So, for people in training, who cares if you tap? You should be focusing on skill building. Don't try to do ego building just by beating people in the gym.
I mean, is that why you think that, like, maybe people are told to go as hard as possible in the gym? It's just a stupid way of training. The guys that go balls to the wall and they end up blowing out and hurting. Because, I mean, I can't remember when I first seen it, but they were on about, strengthening your tendons or, like, stabilizing them and working in your body. And, and I used to always think, okay, what's the best exercises for stabilizing the body? But like you're saying, it's all kind of unique to the person, because there's no point being super able to defend in a certain method if your body can't handle a certain excess, push on an extra range of motion, and it immediately hurts. So you're dictated by your body. But do you hate that question of what's the best exercises to pick because it's so unique to the person and their history?
No, I mean, people just might not like the answer, because that's my answer. It's person specific, so I can't give them the answer. So I don't. As long as they're okay with my answer, then I'm okay with the question.
Because it probably comes down to, like we were saying before, it's that the laziness approach of like, okay, just give me a general answer. Just say, here's a program to go work, and I don't, you've given me your 45 quid. I don't care if it works or not.
Yeah.
I mean, how would you want somebody to start building up this endurance, this work capacity? Because I used to think I could power lift, I could throw deadlifts around. I was the man. I used to think I was the ball, belly big bollocks, as the Scots say. But as soon as I came to jiu-jitsu, I couldn't get my legs over my head. I was out of breath just after a 5-minute round. It's a completely different beast. How do we build up to a level of work capacity so we're not injuring ourselves just turning up in the mat?
I think some of it is also the way that you approach training. So don't get me wrong. Like, people are listening to this and like I can train hard. I've competed in mixed martial arts. I still, I've competed at black belt level. So like I'm still going after it. But when you're training, your job is not to be a better athlete than your opponent. Your goal is to try to make them a less athletic than you. So a lot of training is going to be based on obviously being efficient with movements, because you can think there's some people that have a cardio deficiency, like literally they just have a poor cardio. But then there's some people that are just very inefficient with their movements. That's why, like, white belt versus black belt, there's actually a lot of black belts that have like really piss poor cardio, but they're so efficient you would never know. So when I'm training, like, I'm trying to be as efficient as I can. I want to use as little energy as possible to accomplish whatever my task is, whether it's a takedown, a sweep, submission, whatever it is. The goal is to use as little energy as possible. So like for me, even though I teach class, I actually like don't want to be promoting people because like for me, like I wouldn't give someone a purple belt if they can't flow roll, meaning that you should be able to train without relying on physical gifts. Don't get me wrong, having good cardio helps, being strong super helps, being big helps, being flexible helps, but you should have a game that is not reliant on those capacities because you might be in a position where they're no longer there, right? Like maybe you take time off, you come back and your cardio is terrible. Maybe you have an injury, so even though you were strong, now you're not. So ultimately, you want to have a game that's independent of physical traits. When you compete, obviously they'll matter. That's why like it's very fascinating if you watch guys who are small, like Gordon Ryan. He was my size, and now he's not, but he has a little guy game and a big person body. Like he doesn't. I mean, yes, I'm sure that him being strong helps, but he was winning like EBI Absolute as like a 180 pounder. And then now he's like a 230. So imagine like he had the skill of a smaller guy, but now he's the body of someone 50 pounds bigger. So like that's probably why he's one of the best ever.
Because I think it maybe was Ryan I was watching, and he barely moved except for to better the position. He kind of controlled it and held it, and every move was just an incremental little change, a little push in to get into the position he needed. And I remember rolling with my coach, first time I'd ever rolled with a black belt, and it was like, bloody hell. You just felt like he was like a jaguar ready to strike. There was no kind of like fighting every constant. It was just moving, and as soon as he's ready, you felt like you had no control over it. How would you start analysing somebody that came to you? You know, how do you look for the energy leaks, the dodgy rotation, the whatever it is? How do you start giving them that individual plan to break it down? What kind of tests and focuses would you put on that athlete to see where they're going right and wrong?
Well, so we can look at two ways. We can look at it from the instructor perspective, or we can look at it from the training perspective. So for training, I actually wear a heart rate monitor when I roll, and then I can look at it afterwards. And sometimes what I've noticed, and I'm actually going to get a VO2 max test in 2 days, but I had this test about 5 years ago, and one of the things that was very interesting is they said that I went into my anaerobic threshold a little bit early, but I was able to stay there longer. Meaning that if you take cardio, so before you get to your anaerobic threshold, you're using your aerobic, not using oxygen, which is a much more efficient. When you're using your anaerobic system, now you're using glucose and it's less efficient. And I think, and that was very interesting because this was before I really wasn't doing any outside cardio. I was just kind of curious. And then since then I have been. So I want to see how things change, is if my aerobic capacity has gotten better. Because if I have a strong anaerobic capacity, but then I also have a strong aerobic capacity, that means that when I am pushed, I can go into that capacity and I'm good. It's like a good way to think about it for people is when people have a strong aerobic base, they're able to keep that strong, consistent pace that doesn't fluctuate, versus there's some people that like they get to a pace and they can hold that pace for like 3 minutes and then they completely gas out. Right? That would be like when their anaerobic threshold fails because they go to that point where they can't maintain it. So for me, what I would do is if this athlete was training, I would put a heart rate monitor on and I would observe to kind of see how are you doing. Are you able to stay in like that blue recovery zone? Are you in that conditioning zone? Are you in that overload zone? Specifically trying to stay out of that red zone, because usually that means that you're probably using a lot of energy. That makes sense?
Definitely, because I mean I remember rolling. No, it wasn't even rolling. What was I doing? It was like table tennis or something in PE, and they used to get us to wear heart rate monitors over a selection of sports to see how you went. And I used to think, I'm not that tired until I noticed it on the graph, and the data didn't lie. But how much of data analysis, how much of testing, all these graphs like the whoosh armbands and all these kind of things and the mood rings and stuff, do you find any of them actually work, or is it down to specific testing, putting people into the environment where it mimics the environment they're going to be facing? Are any of these kind of add-on accessories and data mining methods worth it, do you think?
Well, it depends on how they use it, right? If you just wear it and then you roll and you don't do anything, it doesn't help you, right? But I feel, for me, and I think the equipment wise, the chest strap heart monitor tends to have the best results. When there's like a ring or an armband, they tend to be less accurate. But again, if let's say, like, perfect example. So today I'm teaching 2 classes. I taught 1 class in the morning. I'm teaching 1 at night. So generally, there's 1 class I'm going to take a little bit lighter, and then 1 I can roll a little bit harder. Yeah. So what I did was I could say, okay, well, let's see, am I actually where I need to be? And what this does is this gives me information, right? So last week I had 2 hard training sessions, and I'm in my 30s, right? So then the next day I look at my recovery, and it was pretty piss poor. And I realized it took me like 3 days for my recovery to really bounce back, because I just overtaxed myself on Monday. Versus if, let's say, I have a light day and then a hard session, I'm going to compare and see, do I recover better? How do I feel? Right? You know, like I said, I'm getting a VO2 max test in 2 days. So, like, I don't want to go in with my recovery shot, because that's going to affect testing, right? I would like to go in on Wednesday when I do that. Because for people who don't know, VO2 max test is essentially like an absolute failure. Like, you're going until you cannot go anymore. So, but it's a way that I can kind of assess my aerobic and my anaerobic capacity. So I am very curious. So again, it depends on the athlete, how they use it. You know, there's times where people, they don't realize that they're using so much energy. And that's why I talk about from like a skill perspective. Like when I teach, I try to teach more concept based. Like when I'm teaching something, like today we were dealing with leg entanglements and how to kind of stay safe from leg locks. But first, people need to kind of like understand, like, what is the leg locker trying to do? What are your paths for success to escape? Because like what happens is, let's say you just like you go roll, like, and someone's trying to break your foot. Like a lot of times people don't have a good answer, so now and they have to make the decision very, very quick. So they're just kind of spazzing out to try to get out. Versus first you have to know what your plan and your pathway is. Then you can try to speed up so you're more ready. But again, that's more of a cognitive speed than like a physical speed. But when people are inexperienced, they don't know better, so they just go faster because they're trying to not get tapped.
It's time for a quick break. There are millions of potential products to buy, so how do you know which ones are worth your hard-earned money? Simple. You go to nextlevelguy.com/affiliates and explore those that will transform and improve your life. You'll find deals, listener exclusives, and special offers with some great companies. Recommendations are 100% honest and only on items Ian has tried or believes in. The companies showcased will make you a better man in all areas of your life. Simply go to nextlevelguy.com/affiliates and level up.
I mean, how much of that is like that spatial awareness that people don't know? Because I mean, I can remember when I first started, I thought I was doing great. And then when you'd watch a video that your professor would record, and it'd be like, oh, I didn't realize my arm was rolling out there. You know, how much of it is, can we learn to train so you understand yourself as components rather than a body? So you can actually think, well, I'm using my head to rest here to create like a frame. I'm using my arm here. I need to lift leg. You know, how much of it is that we don't know ourselves? You know, that we don't know where our body is in the 3D game of chess. Because, like, you could ask people, like, what did you eat? And they won't understand the effect caffeine has on their body, their food, the night out a couple of weeks ago. Like you're saying, people coming in absolutely knackered. But we don't even know where our bodies are in space half the time. How do we develop that understanding so we can keep ourselves safe from leg locks? How we can sprawl without leaving something and landing on a elbow dodgy? How do we become more aware of our bodies in that sense?
Sure. So again, it goes back to skill and physical capacity. Physical capacity training. So I do a lot of joint training. There's an exercise from the functional range systems called a controlled articular rotation, or a CAR. And essentially it's an isolated joint movement, and I can do one for every joint in my body. And I think those outer range rotational movements are very good for stimulating the joint capsule, which is how people develop proprioception, right? So this is kind of like activity independent. Then we could talk about sport. So as there's a beginner, and there's a study by, I think it was Bernstein. So essentially, like when you learn a sport, and this is really easy if you've ever seen people who do like striking art. So like you're showing someone how to throw a punch, and they look kind of like a Tin Man, like everything, because like everything's super tight, and they just kind of like throw just their arm. And then as they start to develop, they start to loosen up degrees, meaning that let's say they're punching, people don't know any better, so they just tighten every joint in their body. Well, we know from a striking perspective, the tighter you are, it's actually going to slow you down. So then as people get better, they start to release some of those joints. So then you look at a good striker, and essentially their punch looks like a whip. Like it's super fast. They're rotating their foot, their hip, their knee. They're rotating their torso. So essentially, it's a very fluid movement. But that's, I think, a skill development where as people learn the movement, they learn how to kind of relax. That's why it's very fascinating when you watch two beginners train in the gi, because people don't know any better. So they just get their two grips and they just kind of like do this like 6-minute isometric contraction and nothing happens. That's why I'd almost argue, and I'm not being like super, it's just more of a philosophical question than being like a hard about it. I actually would argue that training no-gi might be better for a beginner, just because I want to teach someone to learn how to control the body without the gi. And then I also want to make sure that when you add the gi, there's just other constraints to worry about. You're just adding things. Like when I watch beginners, they don't know any better. They just grab the gi and they don't really know what they're doing. They're just holding onto the gi. When it's like you should be using your feet and your legs to like maintain guard, push them away. Obviously, you could argue one way or the other. It's just kind of like an interesting thing to think about.
It makes a lot of sense because when I first started, it was a lot of gi. I only did no gi, and about a couple of months into it, and suddenly not having the fail safes like you would always be looking for, and you'd be like, "Oh, I don't know if I can control somebody." And people say, "Oh, well, they would always be wearing a jacket. They'd always be whatever," but you kind of think maybe you should be doing like a mix of the two.
Sure.
And talking of clothing and that, most people sitting there just now going, it's okay, I wear straps. I've got my knee thing on, I've got my knee sleeves, I've got my elbow pads. Does any of this really work to a point of just, I know it probably loosens up and heats up the joint to get a bit more flexible and mobile
Sure.
and stuff. At what point is it more of a prehab versus rehab? How much are these useful?
The literature is pretty consistent that strength and conditioning proper rehab is by far the most important thing. Like it's not even comparable. Like if your knee is compromised, no brace is really going to make a big difference. Like you should, if you are a serious athlete and you want to do combat sports and you have an injury, rehab, have a good strength and conditioning program. So I've done, because I've been getting into these, people see that I've been very frustrated with like the anaconda brace, which is like a very, despite how good or how bad the brace is, the company is a very unethical way of marketing, and I feel like they're reliant on those jiu-jitsu like drug addicts who like they just want anything to get back on the mats. Oh, I'll wear a brace, it'll be good. So I've done like a deep dive into like what braces actually do, and to try to not make this too long of a conversation, there's going to be like 3 types of braces. So you're going to have a patellofemoral brace, so like one that'll keep the kneecap in place. Then we can have what's called a functional brace, which is going to be those ones with like a very thick metal hinge, which you can't actually train with. But you might see like people like doing football or soccer, like they might wear those, right? Those functional braces. And then what you can see in jiu-jitsu most classically is going to be those prophylactic brace, which is like those Velcro braces where they wrap up. So research is pretty consistent. The functional brace you can't train with might reduce MCL strain by like 30%, but that's about it. You can't actually wear that. Those prophylactic braces you can wear in jiu-jitsu don't actually give you any physical stability benefit. So if you had an MCL strain, it doesn't actually help you. There is some theory that the brace does enhance that joint sense you talked about, those proprioception. There was one study that I don't think really matters. It's like, how well can you, this one sense is like, we move your leg in one way, can you reproduce it? I don't think that's super relevant. There was a different study that looked at two different movements. It was like a jump and a pivot, where they'd found that people with a brace would have a little bit better rotational control, which we know that the mechanisms of injury are rotational. However, if you look in jiu-jitsu or combat sports in general, almost every knee brace that I can think about, or knee injury, is going to be a contact injury, meaning someone falls on your leg or they forcefully twist. Non-contact injuries, they do happen. And, I think that happened to Calvin Cater like a year and a half ago. That's a little bit more common in like field sports. So like soccer, football, where people are doing those quick pivots and turn. In jiu-jitsu, you're not really seeing them as those the contact injuries. So if all injuries or most injuries are going to be contact injuries, and the brace doesn't give you that physical support, I don't think it really actually helps. And of all of the data that I've looked at, and there's no data specifically on grappling or combat sports, so most of the research that I'm looking at is field sports. But I mean, the research is pretty consistent that, knee braces are inconclusive if they actually reduce injuries or not. So for me personally, like when I'm working with an athlete, I try to get them off braces as soon as possible, because I think it gives you a false sense of security. And again, if you feel like you need a brace to train, you probably shouldn't be training.
Because how often do you see that the guys that come in and they start training, suddenly they've got their wrists up, they've got the sleeves, the knees, the elbows, they're wearing the head guard, and then all they do is just sit and try to keep you in close guard for the whole 6 minutes, and you're like, what is the point? And they're like, oh, but I need all this to survive. And I'm trying to think, was it Jax in Mortal Kombat when they rip off his arms and they realize he's actually better without his mechanical arms compared to his normal arms? Yeah. And I used to think that I needed the spats, I needed the rash guard and all that. The day I forgot it, I was like, hey, wait a minute, this is actually free. And I still wasn't any good, but I was better than in my head. Yeah. So how much... Oh, sorry.
Well, I'm going to build off that. So for people who say, well, I actually do have personal experience, because if you guys remember from the beginning of the podcast, I had a history of a patellar subluxation, meaning my kneecap used to slide out of place. So I had the surgery. It wasn't great. I still had some issues. Now my leg's weak. I started in jiu-jitsu. So for about my first 5 years of jiu-jitsu, I was religious about having a patellofemoral knee brace. I wouldn't get on the mat if I didn't have that brace. So then I was fighting in Pennsylvania. So the state athletic commission will not let you fight with a brace. And it was actually really bad timing, because I also had rolled my ankle. Like I had a really bad ankle sprain like 11 days before. And it was like the perfect storm. Like I couldn't walk up until that last day. But like I'm just going to take my ankle. So I'm like walking to the cage and they're like, you can't be braced. So I had the ankle wrap and I had 2 knee braces. They made me take it off. And I was like, well, I'm literally outside the cage. I'm not going to just not fight. So I go, I fight, and I win. And I was like, you know what? If I can have a mixed martial art fight and my knees don't explode, I probably don't need them. And that was the last I wore a knee brace, and I've had no issues since.
I love it. It's that kind of moment of, it's like the hero arc in a story. It's that kind of, you lost the weapon that gave you the confidence, but you came back and fought. And I think that's a lot of us just now is going, yeah, but I need such and such. And it's that kind of reliance on something. It's that self-belief that we're not capable, or our bodies are not capable. Because, I mean, a lot of the vernacular we've used is like exploding, fighting, grappling. But, where do peace and love come into this? Because I love how you use those as kind of a breakdown of how to fix and heal and stuff. Sure. How do we use peace and love, but also at what point you've kind of mentioned it earlier, where if you can't kneel, you shouldn't be on the mat, because obviously a lot of guards and stuff there.
Yeah.
What point does an injury become okay, you can train through it, tie it up, peace, love, rice, whatever it is.
Yeah.
And what point does it become don't be so bloody stupid, go and see somebody, get it fixed?
Yeah, and that's kind of hard for me to give like a blanket answer. Like a good example, like I strained my back 2 weeks ago. I took one day off. I was able to modify the way that I trained. I have no issues since, right? So I would say like mild injuries, like, and like that's what, like, people are going to argue. Like their physician, their physical therapist is like, well, they don't train. They don't know. Like I'm actually on the mats and I do hurt myself, but it's the awareness of when you have to take time off. And there's just times where it's going to be a little bit tricky. I would say general statement. So I cannot tell you when you can or can't, but these are some warning signs that I use. So if you're having like resting pain, like you hurt your knee and like your knee is like aching before you even get to jiu-jitsu, you probably shouldn't be training, right? Resting pain means you have an active inflammatory process. Like you should be calming that down. You should at minimum have no resting pain. If let's say, like your knee's unstable, like you feel like your knee's wobbly and you don't trust it, I wouldn't be training. I would go see a physician, right? Because that could be a ligament or a meniscus issue. Unable to walk, that's an important one. And the reason why I say that is you'd think, you can't walk, you shouldn't be on the mat. I was on this Discord group and this guy was saying how someone, one of his training partners just had a knee surgery where he had staples, which means that he probably had a major knee surgery and he's on the mat. I'm like, you fucking idiot. Like that dude should probably not be anywhere close to the mat for like 4 months. And not only is the knee not able to take any stress, but just the infection risk. Like after a major surgery, like they don't even want you to go into a pool for 4 weeks because of the infection rate. And you're going to go on a jiu-jitsu, like a dirty jiu-jitsu mat. Like, come on. Like
Central. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh. So there's some stuff that you would think would be common sense, but it's just not common sense. So I'll say it anyway. Obviously if you take a spine injury, so you're having radiating symptoms. So like you're feeling like radiating symptoms down your arm or your leg, I wouldn't be training. I mean, that's an important one for me. Like if someone has some type of like disc pathology and you can reproduce that radiating pain soon, I would hold them off the mat, because a lot of these things, like for like a disc pathology, like there isn't really a good way to test it. But if I can't reproduce it, then I hope that the disc is at this point no longer pressing on the nerve. If I can reproduce that, because in jiu-jitsu you have to think, now I'm a black belt, right? I can try to pretend like no one's going to put me in danger, but that's just not true. Like the nature of jiu-jitsu is someone's going to put me in a position whether I want to or not, might be by accident. So I could say, I will avoid this, but you just don't know what's going to happen. So for me, I would want to make sure that I cannot reproduce those symptoms before I get them on the mat.
It probably goes back to like the ego thing, doesn't it? It's like, because I broke cartilage in my knee years ago. But it's not a technical term, but I remember coming back and being in agony and terrified of my knee going in certain places. And it took me ages to get back into football, soccer and that. And I thought of coming back with staples in my knee. Oh, just...
Yeah.
It's just terrifying.
Yeah.
And how much of that, though, then, is people not understanding how to come back from an injury? Because I know it's a difficult question, but what are the stages of an injury? And then how much do we use love, like peace,
sure,
injury planning, toughening the joint,
sure,
building back into coming to training? Or is it so unique to the individual that it's difficult to answer?
So the way that I break an injury down to the acute phase, like your knee just popped. It's swollen and it hurts. Then we have the subacute phase. Your resting pains calm down, but you still have activity pain, meaning you do certain movements. That still hurts. Then that next phase, that third phase, is going to be that return. That's going to be returning to like strength and conditioning. That's where rehab will almost look like you're just going to the gym and working out, but your knee's not quite ready for sport. And then that last phase is the return to sport. So that's generally how I look at it. I would say for the most part, phase 1 and 2, so the acute, subacute phase, most physical therapists or physios are going to be pretty good at managing. I would say the sports physical therapists, so the people who specialize with athletes, are going to be a little bit more knowledgeable about returning to strength and conditioning and then return to sport. I would say, unfortunately, and this is kind of like my unique niche because I understand jiu-jitsu well, is I would say that returning to jiu-jitsu is going to be a lot different than like a field sport, right? Like I think a sports physical therapist that deals with like soccer and football is still going to be better than your generic physical therapist. But returning to football is very different from returning to jiu-jitsu or kickboxing. So for me, and a shameless plug, I have a course for physical therapists for this exact thing. It's called Treating the Jiu-Jitsu Athlete. Which is me kind of like going through the different levels, and I include these different movement milestones, kind of what treatment should look like, and kind of like guiding people back to jiu-jitsu. And I'm working on a second course, and then I'll probably do a third course on the striking athlete, because a lot of times when you go to martial arts, people are like, oh, you do martial arts, they're all the same. Well, a kickboxer or a boxer is going to look very different from a judo athlete. So I did want to break it up. At one point, I was going to try to make it all one course, but I mean, my first course alone is like 10, almost 11 hours. So, and that's just jiu-jitsu. So I decided I was going to break it up and just have multiple courses.
I mean, so before we go on, what is peace and love in terms of injury rehab? But if you were to look at those things.
Sure. So the acronym PEACE, the first one, so this is more of like an acute management. So you just hurt your knee. What do you do? So the first thing you want to do is protect it. So when people look at RICE, they would say rest. And the idea is that a lot of people are really stupid. So they're like, well, I don't really know what you're going to do. So let's just rest so you stop irritating the injury. But protect is a little bit more specific. So it doesn't have to be do nothing. It's just don't injure the already injured area. Then we can look at the E for peace, which is going to be elevate. Obviously, someone has an active inflammatory process. We want to reduce the accumulation of inflammation. So then there's the A, which is a lot of people don't realize this, but you actually want to avoid anti-inflammatories. And the reason why is because if someone has an injury, the initial inflammatory process is the beginning to the healing cascade. So if you blunt that initial inflammation, you're actually slowing down healing. The problem with swelling isn't the initial inflammatory process, it's the accumulation of swelling. So you want the inflammation to start, you just don't want it to hang out, which is where the elevation goes, or the next for peace would be compression. My favorite method of dealing with a swelling is a compression. So even though I don't like knee braces, I really like knee compression sleeves to combat that. I find them very, very helpful. And then I think the last one, E, is education, which is obviously you can translate like all these other things, and this might be, actual physio. And then we can look at love, which is the L is, I believe, load management. So people don't realize that, like, you go in and you have an injury, right? We're like, well, I want to get rid of the pain. Pain is not really my goal. My goal is I want to restore that previously injured joint to its pre-injury level of resilience. And probably I want it to be better because if it already got injured, so your pre-injury level is already not good enough. So how do we accomplish this? Well, this is appropriate loading. This could be something like a light isometric. This could be a heavy deadlift. It just depends on where you are in that spectrum, but we do want to appropriately load the injury. I think the O is optimism. So a lot of times you're an injured athlete and they say, okay, I want you to take time off. Well, that sucks. And we know that right after an injury, these athletes are going to have a lot of like sadness and depression, which is going to really unmotivate them. So you really want to be optimistic. V would be that vascularization, which is obviously want to increase blood flow, which is exercise. I forget what the last E is. It might be educate again. I'll have to double check. But in short, that's what the peace and love acronym stands for.
And how much of an education does the user need to understand? Because you'll have people who will sit there and say, okay, I'm going to go to the gym, I'm going to do some rehab, I'm going to do some, I don't know, like dumbbell lateral raises for this, I'm going to use, I don't know, like a certain machine for my knees and stuff. But when we come to like the core, does the core exist in terms of an actual thing? Because is it not a group of muscles and you should be treating it in different rotational patterns and different stresses? Or can we think of the core as one piece of the puzzle, so to speak?
So there are rare situations where people have a quote unquote core dysfunction, but I really find that with athletes, like if you're like an elderly person, you might actually have a weak core. I was working with this guy and he had a spine surgery and, he had a back brace and he wore it. He had to wear it for 6 weeks, but he wore it for 4 weeks longer than he's supposed to. So it was like 10 weeks. So because he essentially didn't move his spine for 10 weeks, his core became so weak. I like honestly wasn't ready for it. Like I just didn't anticipate because it happens so infrequently. I would say for like a combat athlete, it's not that they have a weak core. It's more of an integration problem. Meaning like, let's say you throw a punch. So what's supposed to happen when you throw a punch is you push off the ground with your feet. The energy travels from your feet. Then your trunk needs to be rigid enough to not bleed energy. And then you can transfer the energy from your foot to your hand where you can actually hit your target, right? So I don't necessarily think it's that the core is weak. It's just, are you integrating the movement pattern appropriately to actually transfer as much energy as possible? Does that make sense?
Definitely. Because how much, like, as you start coming back into that, and you start working with somebody like yourself and you start getting healthy, how much do we then continue that going forward? Because I know in like Muay Thai, for example, they used to say about kicking bamboo trees to damage the shins, so they would heal up harder, so
Sure.
you wouldn't feel it. You kill off the nerves in your legs, kind of thing. How much of this applies to jiu-jitsu? I know it's sort of individual, but how much do we need to think, okay, well, I need to keep my rehab in, I need to keep my prehab in, I need to have mobility? Or how often do you see guys just go straight back in and come back out injured straight away?
Yeah. Well, you have to think that your body is like always in this constant state of homeostasis, meaning that if you stress your body appropriately, it will adapt the way that you're looking for, hopefully positively. If you continually stress it and you don't allow that adaptation to take place, like you overtrain, well, now because you're not letting the adaptation happen, it's going to respond negatively. Same thing is if you don't stress your body is going to adapt negatively because it's not getting that stress. So that's what a good strength and conditioning program should be, which is, there are people that will graduate from rehab to strength and conditioning, which is hopefully that strength and conditioning program will be enough stress to maintain your body for your sport. The key thing is the appropriate amount of stress, right? Because when I'm developing a strength and conditioning program for an athlete, I want to stress them as little as possible to get whatever my adaptation is. Meaning, if let's say, you can lift like 100 kilos and you'll get strong, but you're like, but I want to lift 150. You only needed the 100 to get the adaptation. So why would I stress more, right? Or if you're running, let's say you only need to run for like 30 minutes. You're like, but I want to run for 60 minutes. That extra time might not have the same effect. So for me, what I want to do is I want to only do what I need to get my stress. And then as an athlete gets stronger or they get better cardio, that's when you have to up the intensity. That's when you have to lift more intense or run longer, right? Because now your body is at a different level. So to now get the adaptation, you have to stress it more. But I want to do it as little as possible so that I can use all my remaining energy for skill training for my sport, martial art training. Because you have to think like in a lot of sports like football, soccer, they have a season. So their off season, they're just doing strength and conditioning. They're on season, they train their strength and conditioning because they're adding skill training back in. For the most part, for combat sports, there is no season. So you really don't have that time to build a solid strength and conditioning program in.
Yeah.
So you're kind of doing it while you're training. So because of that, because you never really let off skill training, you kind of have to make sure you're only stressing them enough so that they don't, you don't blow them up. And then now that they go to train, now they're too broken and now they're more prone to injury because they're going in too tired.
That's a really brilliant point, that, because it's not like a sport where you have an on and off season, or you have friendlies and warm ups and all that, or teammates. You're kind of literally just training all the time, and a lot of times it's because it helps your mental health or whatever it is. You're training because you've got a kid and it's your me time or whatever, compared to people who are training to win competitions. How much of your training programs do you do cognitively? How much do you work with a person to have a smarter approach to training, to stop comparing themselves, to approach training with longevity in mind, rather than I'm going to just take everybody on because I'm taking it as a slight to my masculinity?
Sure.
How much do you go, well, you want to be on the mats for another 50 years?
Sure.
Do this instead of that. How much do you work on, I want to say it's like the stupidity of the man, because
Sure.
I know I would fight every role to try and win. Now I'll go back, I will try to better every role, regardless how much I tap. But at the start, I would have fought you on every single fight. But now I'm like, my brain is working. How much do you work with that person to mature them?
Yeah, it depends on the person, obviously. So like with some of my students that come to my class, I work with a lot of college kids, so they're that like young age. So, a lot of stuff like in my jiu-jitsu class, I'm really kind of focusing. I kind of preach, hey, skill building's our goal. And I always tell people like I'll tap, and people will see me tap, but that doesn't mean I can't go hard. And they've seen me go hard with people. Like I'll roll with, brown or black belts that will weigh me by 80 pounds and I can do just fine. So that's the key thing that I show there is like, so where I train, I'm the smallest black belt, but I can roll with every single, even if the brown or black belt outweighs me by like 100 pounds, I can still have no problem rolling with them. So I think, by showing this, like, look, I'm not just like making shit up. Like what I'm doing is working, obviously. Even though I have physical capacity, this guy who's like, 280 is way stronger than me. So if I just try to outmuscle him, I'm going to lose, right? I need that technique. From a client perspective, because again, even though I have several different jobs because I teach jiu-jitsu, but I also work with people remotely for like strength conditioning. And then I work with like in-person people for physical therapy. So it depends on the person. So those people deal with injury. Obviously I kind of have to say, like, I'm giving them a game plan on how to get back. For the remote client who might be more of like a competitor, it depends on them. Like as we're feeding, I can kind of see like, are they the younger guy who I kind of need to like calm down, or because there are a lot of people that I work with that are going to be those master athletes that get it. It's usually the younger people that I kind of have to kind of roll them, like rein them in a little bit and say, hey, like, look, this is what we got to do to stay in this sport for a long time.
Because it's the number of young guys I remember rolling with. They would come in and they would fight you on absolutely everything, and they knew you knew more technique, but they would seem to fight thinking that they could come out and they would always like try to bench press you off, giving the arm, or they would like give the neck, and really silly stuff. Once you learn a bit of technique, and thinking back, I was terrible when mind you, I'm probably not much better now. How much is time is a reasonable amount of time to start changing? Like say we come and see you, we put a plan in place.
Sure.
How long is a reasonable thing to start seeing some improvement or some increase or fix or however you want to describe it? And what tests are you doing along the way to see, are we getting better? Are the healing? Are they getting toughened, the ligaments? Are we more flexible, better endurance, whatever the goal is? Or is it dependent on the person? Say, I want to peak for my competition, or I want to just get back on the mat. How much time and how do you play it as you work with a client?
Sure. So obviously it depends on how I'm working with them. From an injury perspective, it depends on the injury. Like when people have like ACL reconstruction, like that's like a 9-month process. But like let's say someone hurts their knee, it's like an MCL. Depending on the severity, um, there's a tissue healing time, which I can't arbitrarily say. But based on whatever tissue is damaged, we have to keep in mind tissue healing. But along the way, I'm doing several tests. We're checking range of motion, quantity. Can they move their limb where it needs to go? We look at their range of motion quality. Can they do it without pain? Let's say it's the knee, like when it's getting compressed, does it still hurt? That gives me information. We use some of those movement milestones I said. Can you full kneel? Can you squat? Can you combat base, etc.? I do a series of return to sport tests, which might be I look at their deep squat. I look at their single leg squat. So first one, I look for like your quality. Then I can do a quantity so I can compare one side to the other. We can do various jump tests. So there's one jump test, which is like a power endurance. So you keep going side to side for a certain amount of time. I have one, which is just maximal jumping, whether it's horizontal, whether it's like inside or outside. It might be 3 jumps. When I'm in person, I can do an isometric dynamometer test. So literally I compare like how strong is one leg to the other. So those are some of the things I do from like an injury perspective. From a physical capacity standpoint, if let's say I'm working with someone on flexibility and joint health, I'm going to say it's going to probably take about 6 to 8 weeks to see changes for strength. Hypertrophy, same thing. We're looking at about 6 to 8 weeks to start seeing changes. And then from the cognitive perspective, like what you just mentioned, how to rein people in, that's really based on the maturity of the athlete. Like some people get it, some people don't. And, that just depends on the person.
Because this there's so many rabbit holes I'm trying not to go down, and there's so many things I want to just focus on my own training, my own messed up body. I would love to ask you about, but how do you keep on top of this? Because you've got, you're doing all your coaching clients, you're doing all your assessments, you're training, you're competing, you're just taking classes, even just being, you off the mats. How do you keep on top of the ever-changing research, the white papers, even just the terminology sometimes can be difficult to understand. How do you keep your mind on it? Or is that part of the enjoyment for you, is doing the deep dive into it?
Oh, so interestingly, the deep dive that I've done was, there was a while I was just a physical therapist and, I was a black belt and I knew what I was talking about. But when I started going down that deep dive, people know in the US, there's something called a board certified specialty. So I'm board certified in orthopedic medicine, which just means that I'm like good at dealing with musculoskeletal stuff. I did so much of my researching for social media to answer a question. So for me, the fun part is like when an injury happens, like it might be related to jiu-jitsu or MMA. When I have to answer that question, I do some research. I'm dealing with a client that might have like a tricep repair or a pec repair. I'm doing research. So for me, the reason why I like physical therapy is because I have to do that extra outside work. It kind of keeps me interested. So it could be, like I said, I'm answering a question on social media. It could be based on the client from an injury perspective, or it could be sports performance. And actually, another thing I could do is from a skill perspective. So for the longest time, I was much more heavily no-gi. Like I would train the gi like once a week, and I would do it begrudgingly. But I didn't really enjoy gi training. And then I started working with athletes that were gi athletes. And they're doing some stuff that I was like even though I'm a black belt, there's some gi things that I'm not a black belt in. I'm just not that good. So I was like, well, if I'm going to help this athlete, I need to get a little bit better at the sport. I'm obviously understand mixed martial arts and no gi. So then I started diving a little bit more into the gi specific stuff. And again, that's what's so fun about jiu-jitsu is like I've been doing jiu-jitsu like 18 years and I still go to class and I'm excited to learn and try things because it's so vast, you'll never get good at everything. So there's just all these different things. The hardest part is to try to do everything, right? And that's the real trick. But the interesting thing for me is just trying to learn and get better at my craft, whether it's as a physical therapist, a strength and conditioning coach, or a jiu-jitsu athlete or a jiu-jitsu coach.
And would that be your kind of recovery away from jiu-jitsu, that self-betterment, that kind of self-improvement? How should people be, sort of recovering between sessions in jiu-jitsu? How should we be, setting habits for better sleep, for better diet, but also just to recover cognitively, emotionally, spiritually, whatever it is, away from the mats to become better people, do you think?
Yeah, I think that's what hurts a lot of jiu-jitsu people is that guy who I told you about the staples. He had mentioned because he was talking about his training partner. He's like, well, my training partner has nothing else. I'm like, that's really, really bad. That's when you do those stupid things. I think one of the best things I ever did for my career was I had a knee injury. So I had a loose bit of cartilage, which meant that the cartilage would float into my knee would lock up. Essentially, I couldn't really, there was times I couldn't even walk because my knee would be locked in about a 90-degree angle, and I needed surgery. This was around the time where I was working full-time as a physical therapist, but I used that time. I was like, well, I could try to do a bunch of bullshit on the mat and hurt myself and not really get anywhere, or I could just take time off and better. So I started working on my online platforms. And because of that, my wife was always like, why are you doing so much? I would wake up at 5 a.m. to see a client, right? Or I'd be waking up early to go film some video. But all of that kind of carried over. So now I'm in a situation where I can train pretty much as much as my body will let me. I'm in a financially a much better position. I enjoy what I do in a much better spot because I did something else. So I do think it from a mental cognitive situation, it is good for athletes to have a side hobby, something that they can do aside from jiu-jitsu. So when that injury happens, it's not like they're completely lost. Yeah, I think that would probably be, I don't know if I quite answered your question, but.
Because I'm trying to think who said it, that it was something like have 3 hobbies. One that made you money, one that was physical, that allowed you to exert your energies out, and one that was scratching your creative itch. I mean, that's why I love the podcast, but I need that and jiu-jitsu and probably getting rejected in every date I go for. That's become a sport of my own just now. But you used to train with your partner. How did you find that helping your relationship when you were dating somebody who trained as well?
I think that just a good thing is that she understood my passion for jiu-jitsu because she also really likes jiu-jitsu. From a skill development perspective, it's actually been super helpful just because I'm a black belt, she's not, I'm bigger than her. So a lot of times I get to just try things out. And if my wife taps me out, I don't care. It's not oh man, this little woman's going to tap me. I don't care. So for me, it allows me to work on things that I wouldn't be working on with other people. I can work on late stage escapes. So from a skill perspective, it's really good. From a skill perspective from her, it's beneficial because I can help her and I can show her things. She does get frustrated with me. But then again, because it's a passion, she understands that. So, it's not oh, I have to go to jiu-jitsu. She gets it, So I think overall it's good. But, again, there's things that we do outside of jiu-jitsu as well, which is just good for a healthy relationship.
It's trying to explain. I remember one of my exes, and she was like, "What do you mean you get dressed in pajamas and roll with sweaty men?" Honestly, yeah, it's difficult to see unless you get into. It's like a cult unless you get into it. Kind of thing. How often do you get asked things like, "What's a secret sauce supplement?" Are you asking for the latest mushroom, the latest lion's mane, the latest whatever it is? Do we always want the sneaky? There must be a little supplement you can give us as a.
Yeah. I'm not a big supplement guy. I keep it super simple. Creatine, fish oil, I just keep it super simple. I think a lot of times these secret supplements, if anything sounds too good to be true, it probably is. Like when you like CBD, like it cures everything. I'm like, that's a load of shit. Like it doesn't.
Yeah.
But I think for me as a someone who's an academic, like what is the research saying? You do have to consider too. A lot of time research is behind. So like people talk about peptides. Peptides might do stuff. It just right now there's just not enough data for me to like endorse them. Like not only do we not know like what tissue is going to respond well, we don't know the longitudinal studies, like what are the negative repercussions. There's some evidence that it might like enhance tumors. A lot of times with something like peptides. Now I have seen, now you're in the UK, so I work with an athlete who was prescribed peptides by his physician. And I think if you are going to do it, you should be working with a physician. A lot of times, especially in the US, like people get like a black market supplement from a peptides like meant for horses. I'm like, dude, like, what are you doing? Like, so the best that I can is I look at what research says, and I look at I'll talk to medical professionals because something like stem cells, PRP, they've been used for the last like 15 years, but only now is it starting to see evidence of support, just because research is always going to be behind. So you can kind of see, but again, I would trust what the physicians are saying, not like what your buddy in the gym who's just taking some black market supplement saying.
Because it's quite amazing just now how many people will take what a presidential candidate says as gospel, how much like their latest celebrity they'll start taking something, no idea if it'll counteract with any medicines or anything like that. It's just because it's the damn thing. If Taylor Swift says it, they need to do it, or if so and so says it. What would you want the evolution of your brand to be? Because you keep everything you hit seems to just be knocked out of the park. You're doing all these great programs. How do you want to build, or are you just happy doing as you are, kind of exploring and putting out your own findings to help yourself learn and understand and help your clients? What do you want to do in the future?
Yeah, so that's interesting. I think for me, I want to get more products out. Like I said, there's another physical therapy course I want to release for jiu-jitsu guys. I want to release one for strikers. I've considered doing like a physical therapy mentorship, like an online, so people who want to work with me directly. I was thinking about doing like an online community for physical therapists. So like where like we can all just kind of like brainstorm and talk. I'm thinking about trying to make like a website, find a provider. So for you, if you're in the UK, you're like, well, is there any physio that understands jiu-jitsu? Like what if I could find someone, right? Because the local physio down the road probably doesn't know anything about jiu-jitsu. But what if there was one in the town over, right? So I think those are some of the like products I want to do. I did a longevity course in Seattle a few weeks ago. That was a lot of fun. I want to start doing that more. I would like to have an in-person physical therapy course. So for people who don't know, like physical therapists and physios have to do like continuing education. So like if you come to my course, I can give them that Con Ed that they need to maintain their license. So that stuff's fun. At one point, I was thinking about doing a podcast, but this is my 6th podcast this month, and I'm getting burnt out. So I don't know if I want to do that. So, there's a lot of ways I can go. Right now, I'm in a pretty good situation in my life where, again, I get to teach jiu-jitsu, I get to train jiu-jitsu, I get to learn judo, I get to work with jiu-jitsu athletes all over the world, and I get to work in-person physical therapy for people. So I have a lot of different hats, but it kind of like makes it so I never get burnt out.
I love that. And what's your way of looking at life? Like, how, if you look back at this in 10, 20 years, 50 years, whatever it is, what do you want your legacy to be as Mike the man, Mike the content creator? How much do you think of like memento mori about dying and your legacy? Or are you just enjoying the ride in life? Because a lot of guys just now we don't know what we want from life, and suddenly you're 80 and go, fuck, what happened? What do you want your legacy to be?
From a personal perspective, I just would like to experience things, travel. Me and my wife, we're in a situation now where we can travel, so it's like go see other parts of the world. I think just experiencing traveling and doing like that is just a way that you just need stuff to look forward to. From a professional standpoint, I think if I can kind of somehow make these combat athletes, these jiu-jitsu athletes, less of these like bonehead muscle, these just people being idiots. I think if I can change the culture, I think that I would say that like my effort in social media was successful. Just kind of make them less idiots about injury. Like let's focus on longevity. Let's not be a moron.
That should be the tagline for a lot of jiu-jitsu gyms. I mean, I know we've gone way over our time. I'm really sorry for using up so much of your time, but you're such a joy to speak to. It feels like 10 minutes, and there's so many rabbit holes I'd love to go down and do future ones and bring other people on as well. But what do you want people to take from this? How can we summarize this? Is there something we can do? Is there a challenge? Is there a remembrance of a focus that you want people listening to this who are going into jiu-jitsu, maybe a fat, sweaty guy like myself, somebody who's taken it up as a completely newbie? How can we approach jiu-jitsu and use the teachings from this podcast to better ourselves in jiu-jitsu and in life?
I would say the point of class is skill building, not ego building. So get better at jiu-jitsu. That doesn't mean you have to be winning every roll. I would say tap. I mean, I tap. I'm a black belt. I'll tap to people. I don't care. When I stopped caring about tapping is when I noticed a lot of improvement with my jiu-jitsu. Like, who cares? Like, I think Gary Tonin was saying something like he might be going in a training session. He might tap like 20 times. Now, it could be an exaggeration, but it could be he's rolling with the killers of New Wave. But like you take someone like Gary Tonin, who's like one of the best black belts in the world, and he's tapping 20 times in a session. If you're a purple belt, like what do you care? Like it doesn't matter, right? So tap. You have an injury, address it early. Don't let it become this chronic thing that now in 10 years you're going to need surgery to address. I would say those are some key things you can take away from this podcast that really anyone who does combat sports or interested will benefit from.
Love it. And until we can get another one in the books and really kind of go down into each of these sort of pockets, how can we follow along? How can we find out about these training courses? Because I'm assuming that you should be doing TED Talks, books. You're one of the few people that could actually fix people before they get completely fucked up. How can we follow along in this amazing journey you're on?
Yeah, I would say the best way is Instagram. My handle is Dr_Kickass. And in my bio, I have all of my courses. If people want to work with me remotely or contact me for any type of, that'll be the best way to contact me.
Well, that's it for another week. And thank you for listening. It's now time to take what you've learned and use it to develop and enhance your life with the key points mentioned. Listen, try it, embrace it, use it, and crush it. Now's your time to hit that next level in your life. If you liked this episode, then please leave a comment on the show notes or a review of the show on your podcast platform. Everything helps evolve the show. Until next week, keep seeking the next level in your life.